So if you have any questions, please email them to questions@pbears.org, or if you're watching on the Tundra Connections webpage on the polarbearsinternational.org website, you'll see a chat window below the screen, and you can also put questions in there. We have moderators watching. If you happen to be watching on Facebook, you can put your questions on the Facebook page, though we will be a little slower to answer those, but please feel free to email at questions@pbears.org even if you are watching on Facebook. So thanks so much again for watching today. It's going to be a lot of fun. We are looking for polar bears just outside the window. We've seen a couple already today, so we'll keep our eyes out and hope that one wanders close again while we're speaking to you. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panel. My name is Elise McCall, and I'm a staff scientist and director of conservation outreach at Polar Bears International. Jeff?
My name is Jeff York. I'm senior director of conservation, also at Polar Bears International.
My name's Evan Richardson, and I'm a polar bear research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada.
And my name is Jon Aarsj, and I'm working for the Norwegian Polar Institute, and we are working with polar bears in Svalbard, Norwegian Arctic.
Great, thank you. So we've got people that work in 3 different countries with polar bears in kind of different capacities, and we're going to ask them about how they got to where they are. And we already are getting questions in, which is great. Please keep sending those. But maybe I'll just get everyone to talk just for a minute or so about some things that their job entails. So Jeff, you've had quite a long career doing different things with polar bears. Maybe you could compare your work in Alaska to your work with Polar Bears International?
Sure. So I started out working for the U.S. federal government in Alaska, part of the USGS polar bear program there for a decade, and then moved on to what I'd call the science policy interface side of the equation, and started working with nonprofits, first WWF and now Polar Bears International, and really trying to make sure that the best science being done, now more by my colleagues than by myself, is making it to policymakers, managers, and to you, the public. So a very different side, but all important parts of the equation, making sure that we're using sound science to inform excellent policy, ideally.
Great, thanks. And Evan, what sorts of things do you do in your job day to day?
So day to day, my job varies quite a bit. I can be writing grant proposals to find research funding to go out in the field. I can actually be doing field work out working on polar bears. We do population studies. We catch polar bears and try and understand their health and their population ecology, their genetics. I can be attending meetings with people like Jeff where we're talking about policy and management of polar bears and how science can play a role in decision making for the conservation of the species. When I have free time, we always like to look at our data that we're collecting in the field, and we write scientific papers that we publish. We also do media things like this, working with Polar Bears International, where we talk to the public about our research and let people know what's happening with polar bears around the Arctic.
Thanks, Evan. And Jon, what kind of stuff are you doing day to day with polar bears in Norway?
I'm actually doing exactly the same as Evan.
Great.
So the best part of the job, I think, is being out in the field. So we are out the whole of April every year, and then occasionally some weeks other parts of the year, getting as much data as possible. And the main reason for trying to get this data is to analyze it and see if we find things that can help us manage the polar bears in the best possible way. So then we give advice to the management authorities, you know.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Well, we already have some questions coming in. Jeff, maybe I'll start with you. Can polar bears live in the Antarctic?
Polar bears likely could live in the Antarctic, and they would probably love it there, at least for a short time. All of the other animals that currently call that home would not be so happy. Mm-hmm. In Antarctica, you basically have no terrestrial top predator. And so the species that live there, the ones we think of most obviously are penguins and seals, would be completely naive to polar bears. And it would be pretty ecologically devastating for Antarctica if we tried to introduce polar bears down there.
Not good for penguins so much.
No.
Great, thanks guys. So maybe now we'll talk a little bit about how you all got into it. you're doing now. I know students out there are very curious about what kind of schooling they need, what kind of skills they might need to harness if they want to get into whether it's polar bear science or any type of wildlife or science. Maybe Evan, do you mind giving us a little overview of how you ended up where you did? Did you always want to do polar bears?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of fell into polar bears. My first trip to the Arctic was actually here to Churchill in Western Hudson Bay, and that was back in 1998. I got a summer field job actually working on plants, and I wandered all around the Hudson Bay coast here and in the interior in a park called Wapusk National Park. I worked 2 summers up here. I saw my first polar bear in the wild, which was absolutely amazing. Caribou, Arctic foxes, red foxes, just an amazing diversity of species here in Western Hudson Bay, and I ended up doing some work on Arctic and red fox den site selection, so where the foxes make their dens to give birth to their pups. And after that, I just happened to be at a meeting with Ian Sterling, who is one of the world's foremost experts on polar bears, and I had lunch with him, and then he asked me if I wanted to come to Edmonton, Alberta in Canada to do graduate work. So I started a master's on polar bears, looking at actually polar bear den sites here in Western Hudson Bay, and then things just kind of snowballed from there. I did a PhD and got a job, and now I work full-time for the federal government.
Excellent, thanks. And Jan, did you start out studying polar bears, or did you have a different path?
A very different path, actually. I was interested in biology, so I started with biology at the university of Oslo in Norway, and I wanted to do a master on birds, so I found a master and went to a guy and asked, and somebody else had just robbed that master thesis in front of me, so he said, well, but if you want, you can work with small rodents. So then I did that for 10 years, and then I went abroad for 4.5 years in Scotland working with small rodents, and then I wanted to go back to Norway. And I had been in Norwegian Arctic quite a bit in Svalbard earlier, so I thought it was a nice system up there, and I applied for a position working on reindeer in Svalbard and got to an interview and just got beaten by another one again, always number 2. And a week after they called me and said, we're sorry you couldn't work with reindeer, but maybe you want to work on polar bears. So then I worked on polar bears.
Excellent. Well, there's different paths to ending up in polar bears, it seems. How about you, Jeff? Where did you start out?
Mine is different yet again, and probably somewhat unique in the polar bear world. I started out as an English major
That is different.
Came to Alaska to visit a friend, quickly realized an English degree in the North is only somewhat useful by itself, and went back to school, and through that ended up working on a marine mammal project that was absorbed by the USGS polar bear team, and that was that.
Excellent. Well, lots of different paths to polar bears. Well, maybe we can take another question real quick. So Jeff, I'm going to give this one to you. Can all polar bears live in zoos?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, zoos have very limited space. In North America right now, I don't know the total number, but it's a surprisingly small number of polar bears that are actually in captivity in North America, a bit more in Europe, where they have a few more facilities, but a very limited space. You can imagine a species like a polar bear needs, reasonably sized enclosures and very specialized, so it's quite expensive to also keep them the way they need to be kept in captivity, so no.
Right.
Yeah.
And another question, Jan, can polar bears live in Greenland?
Yeah, it is quite a lot of polar bears in Greenland.
Yeah.
So I should have had a colleague of us working in Greenland, but I've actually been visiting her and seen some of their bears. They look much the same as they do in Svalbard, actually. Greenland is a huge island, and there is polar bears along a lot of the coast in Greenland on both sides. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's keep moving on. I'd like to ask you all your favorite thing about your current job, and maybe I'll start with Jeff.
Sure, this will probably be a similar answer for all.
It might be. I bet it is.
No, I like a lot of aspects about what I do and feel incredibly fortunate to do the work I do and where I do it and who I do it with. But the field work, I think for almost all biologists I know, there are some people that are more geared towards the lab, but for most of us it's being out in the habitat. And for those of us that have worked in the Arctic, I think we're incredibly fond of this place, both out at sea on the sea ice, but also here on the tundra. It's something that kind of gets into you.
Absolutely. Evan?
I have a fairly similar answer to Jeff's in that I really do enjoy getting out and seeing these wild places and working on polar bears. But one of the funnest aspects of my job is sharing that with people for the first time. So people that come out and work in the field with us, or even just tourists in places like Churchill, just seeing the excitement when someone sees their first polar bear in the wild is really special, and it reminds me of the importance of the work we do and the messages we do here with PBI on the conservation of the species. And so being able to share that with people is a really great aspect of my job.
Thank you. And Jan?
Yeah, I'm afraid I have to say the same, that by far the fieldwork is the highlight for me. It's that's why I'm a biologist. It's because I always thought it was fun and nice to be out looking at wildlife. So that's what I did when I was a kid, and that's what I did when I grew up. And if I didn't have the fieldwork, I would have done something else for sure. But beside that, I think from time to time, when you dig into the data and find something, particularly if you find something you didn't expect, something surprising, that make you learn something new about polar bears, that can also be very, very nice. But typically this is something that happens 5 or 10 minutes every year. You suddenly thought, whoa! And the fieldwork is something that goes over weeks, and you always see new things when you're out in the field. No day is the same as the other day. And that's not only polar bears, it's all the wildlife in the Arctic, which is great. So
Yeah.
I think we're privileged to be able to work in the field.
Definitely. Yeah, it's absolutely a privilege to be out here. And it's such a neat thing to be able to add new knowledge to what we know about polar bears and help conserve them in different ways. We do have a question that I'll send to you, Evan. What kind of equipment do you use in the field to study polar bears?
Yeah, we have loads and loads of equipment to work on polar bears. It's fairly logistically intensive. A lot of the work that Jeff and Jan and I do involve helicopters. We need to get to remote places where these polar bears live in the Arctic, and so obviously there's no roads and boats are pretty slow, and we need to get out on the sea ice. So we typically have helicopters, probably with a couple of 100 pounds at least of field gear. So we have scientific instruments for measuring the bear and monitoring its vital rates while it's sleeping from immobilizing drugs. We have a variety of scales to measure the weight of the bears. We have GPS technology so we don't get lost out on the sea ice. We carry technology with us that we put out on the polar bears, like collars, GPS tracking collars to see where the bears go. And so we have bags and bags of gear, and we also have safety gear. If we get stuck out on the sea ice, we need a shelter, and we need a stove to stay warm, to be able to melt snow and have water if we have mechanical issues with the helicopters. So it's very intensive in terms of the amount of field gear and equipment we bring with us.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And a little bit expensive, but well worth it. So I'd like to ask you all, for any students right now that might be watching, especially if you're maybe in high school and you're needing to make decisions about what you want to do, if you're going to enter university, maybe we could hear a little bit of advice from each of you about, finding a path, maybe not even necessarily only to polar bears, but what sort of advice would you give, say, a student in grade 11 or 12 right now trying to figure out how to get involved in the wildlife world? Maybe we'll start with Jeff.
Sure, I would just say, clearly, when and where you can, science background. So study up. Some of the intro classes for sure are a little bit tough to get through sometimes, but they get you beyond that to classes you'll find super interesting, and they'll be much more applied there. So it's important you get the base work down in class. And two, just keep an open mind as far as opportunities around your communities. It could be anything from volunteering at a zoo. If you have a community zoo, it could be volunteering with a veterinarian or volunteering at an animal shelter or something like that, but getting hands-on experience. If you live in an agricultural area working with farm animals, FFA, groups like that are fantastic for, hands-on.
Thank you. And Evan?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just echo Jeff's suggestions, and the two biggest things that can influence your ability to get in a job in a field like Arctic research is your education and your experience. So you need to be knowledgeable and have a skill set in terms of statistical analysis, the ability to write scientific reports, to write research proposals. So you have to be an effective communicator of your knowledge, and then you also need experience in the field. So the ability to come to places like this and be able to work in the field and use scientific equipment, and quite often, as Jeff suggested, a good way to get that experience is to do some volunteer work, to contact people. And even though you may be interested in working on polar bears or marine mammals, getting experience, working on small mammals like Jan did, ended up paying off for him getting a job as a polar bear biologist in the end. So you never know where your road's going to go, and if it's a learning opportunity and an opportunity where you can get some experience, it's probably going to be a good thing for you in the end.
Thank you. And Jan, what advice would you have?
Yeah, no, much of the same. I think the type of people you need, in programs is people that both have a good theoretical background. So, and it's not like you start reading about polar bears. It's much more to get a wide knowledge about wildlife and ecology or something else that can be useful. And also that you also have the ability to be out in the field without not being able to work. You often see people, and if you're not used to it and you get out when it's minus 25, it could be a lot of people that do a very good job when it's warm. That doesn't work very well. So maybe you should start sleeping out during the winter or being able to see how you survive when it's cold, because that's also important to know how to be able to actually be in the Arctic. And it's not for everyone, it is cold. But it's possible to make yourself comfortable if you just know how to do it.
Oh, too funny. Yeah, staying warm is a big part of working with polar bears, of course. So what I'm hearing is, it's important to volunteer, and I would echo everything the panel said. If you're finding opportunities to volunteer with anything to do with wildlife, I think that is great. I volunteered with quite a few different places, including a zoo and on a small mammal projects and badger projects before working with polar bears. And I volunteered with Polar Bears International for 4 years before actually working for Polar Bears International. So that's great. And the communication is just huge. So we have a small staff at Polar Bears International, but a wonderful staff. And I'm not sure if BJ, there we go, BJ's going to pull this up. So 4 of us on the staff are scientists with a science background, but everyone on the staff contributes hugely in different ways. We've got Marisa and Barbara and Janet on the bottom there with backgrounds in psychology and communication, and Janet does their marketing. Meg on the right middle there, so she's got a science background, but is also an incredible artist, and even will sell her art and give some proceeds to charities, including PBI. She does a great job. We've got, of course, Emily at the top there with more of an arts background, but does some of our marketing and just an amazing communicator. And then we've got BJ in the top left there, who you don't see on camera right now, but he's running this whole show, and he's the Buggy One driver, among many other things, and works on a lot of our research projects, making sure that technology is working well and that we're collecting great data. So there's all sorts of different paths to polar bears with common themes: communicating, working hard. Those are really, really important, and working together. I think I remember being in high school, and not necessarily the biggest fan of group projects in high school, but I think it's good experience. You have to work with a lot of different groups to work with polar bears or whatever you're going to do, and it sure helps when everyone you're working with is intelligent and really inspired. But working with other people is a big one too. So lots of great skills that people can harness. So we've got some more questions coming in. Neat. So let's start with this one. So Jeff, what would you say is the most important thing that scientists need to learn about polar bears right now?
Oh.
That's a tough one.
It is a tough one. I'm going to say it depends on what scientist you ask.
Yes, totally.
Boy, that might actually stump me.
Yeah, well, there's so many things we still don't know about polar bears.
There's a lot we don't know, and it surprises people sometimes. They're thinking, oh, you've been studying these, this species for 40, 50 years. Why don't you know everything? But when you think about how little we know about our own systems ourselves, people should be a little bit less surprised. And when they think about where polar bears live up here, but I think even though we know that climate warming and sea ice reductions are going to have negative effects on polar bears, there's a lot of important pieces to that puzzle that we don't know. We don't know all the linkages yet as well as we'd like to regarding the when and where and how some of these negative pressures might manifest themselves. So from, increased understanding of some of the climate models to better understanding of how sea ice responds to polar bears themselves, and I would say just as importantly, their prey. So there's a lot we don't know about ice seals, ringed and bearded seals, that would be very important for us as polar bear scientists.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that. We also have a question from Jess, who's looking at graduate programs with a concentration in writing and is wondering about working with nonprofits, and is this a possible career jump? Yeah, I would say depending on where you are in the world, definitely check out nonprofits. We always need excellent writers in all sorts of different fashions, whether you're writing for the general public or writing for grants or technical writing. That is a huge skill. That sort of background is wonderful, and a lot of people can make the jump to nonprofits depending on what kind of nonprofit. One person I didn't mention earlier is our executive director, Krista Wright. Background in science education, worked for years helping teach students about the environment, and now she runs Polar Bears International and has got us to this incredible point. So yeah, you don't necessarily need to start at any one area, but networking, connecting with people, and just harnessing the skills you do have, I think, are all really important to get where you want to go. Oh, sorry, there's a bear around. I think we're going to keep our eyes out outside, but we're also going to wrap up in just a couple minutes. Keep sending in your questions if you have any to questions@pbears.org. Maybe briefly, we will talk about the biggest challenge in everyone's job. So there's a lot of amazing things about polar bears and working with them. But what would you say is the biggest challenge you face, either overall or day-to-day? Jan, would you like to start with that?
For polar bears?
Yeah.
It's no doubt, I think, that it's climate change that is the biggest threat to polar bears, and loss of sea ice. But it is maybe more complicated than people think. But altogether, that is the fact that polar bears actually depend on ice at least parts of the year means that we think that in areas where you will not have sea ice any part of the year, it's no polar bears. It's not today, and it won't be in the future. So this is something that is not so easy to change overnight, and that is the biggest challenge. And then it's a lot of smaller things that it's maybe easier to do things with, but they are smaller challenges in the way that they're not as threatening.
Oh yeah, interesting challenge to work with an animal that faces that sort of habitat loss. And Evan, what would you say is a big challenge in your day-to-day job?
I guess just working in such remote areas, it takes a lot of planning and logistics to get up to the Arctic to be able to work on polar bears and collect the data. And so we work in really remote locations, and typically going out to do field work requires a year in advance, just in terms of planning and getting the field gear you need, getting the fuel that you need, setting up the contracts. And so people think it's pretty glamorous working on polar bears, and you've seen some pictures of the field work we do, but we also spend a lot of time in front of a computer looking at a screen and typing emails and filling out forms. And so when your passion is really to be out in the field and working on these animals, sometimes those long hours in front of the computer can grind on you a little bit, but it's always well worth it.
Thank you. And Jeff?
I would say there's a saying out there, I'm not sure who to attribute it to, but it's something like working with wildlife is easy, working with people is hard. And I wouldn't say just people, but human systems. So our governments, our politics complicate our day-to-day efforts to achieve some of our conservation goals. And conservation itself just takes longer than a lot of us think it should. And it's much more of a process than sort of we won this or we achieved this and then we can move on. It doesn't work that way. It's a constant effort to, keep good policies and programs in place. So trying to be persistently patient and relentlessly optimistic in the face of slow change. is
Yeah.
probably the biggest challenge.
That is challenging. And we sometimes talk about polar bears being a slow conservation species. So for an animal that maybe lives in a grassland or a forest, there's some immediate measures we can take to protect that habitat, whether that's planting more trees or putting up a fence or even hiring people to protect it. But with sea ice, this is a long-term problem. Well, not in the span of the Earth, but this is something we need to work on. We need to look into the future and as a global society help protect sea ice from melting, because we can't just put a border around it and we can't grow more of it right when we want it back. So we're all trying to help the sea ice right now. As we're burning fossil fuels and releasing more and more emissions into the air, those emissions act like a heat-trapping blanket. And as we release more and more emissions, more carbon into the atmosphere, this heat-trapping blanket thickens. And we know when it gets hot outside, ice melts, and so we're losing sea ice in different areas. And we know we can get sea ice back. Research has shown that sea ice will rebound if we can get our carbon emissions under control. And so we're just going to look behind right now. Oh, there's a fox behind us. Well, that's pretty cute. We're going to try to get that on camera for you guys. So another animal that, depends on the ecosystem being healthy out here. All sorts of animals we're watching out here. It's pretty neat. The Path to Polar Bears will also lead you through a path to seeing a lot of other amazing things. So we're going to watch this fox for a minute. Oh,
No.
great.
Got that.
Oh, a hunting fox as we wrap up. Well, that's pretty cool. Thanks for getting that on camera, BJ. Super fun. It looks like he's hunting for maybe voles or lemmings out there. Yeah, pretty neat stuff. We're going to keep our eye on him as we wrap up for the day. So one last question, Jeff. How can we help polar bears as a biologist or as anyone out there?
Sure, anybody can play a part in not just helping polar bears, but helping to protect the Arctic as a whole, and really, the environment we all need everywhere where we live and play and go to school and work. So we know the big problem that polar bears and other species are facing is a warming world. It's warming rapidly, and it's warming because we're burning too much fossil fuel for energy. So we need to figure out ways to use less fossil fuel. We need to figure out ways to be more efficient. We need to use more clean sources of fuel like renewables. And to get there at the scale that's required to kind of meet that challenge, we need to engage politically. So we need to have conversations with our family, our friends, our neighbors, have conversations at school, have conversations at our workplaces, and ultimately talk to our elected representatives and make sure that they are aware of our concerns and that they're willing to act on those concerns.
And maybe some of you students out there will become elected representatives one day, and you'll make great decisions for the environment yourselves, and that would be pretty exciting. So we're going to wrap up. We want to remind you that time absolutely remains to protect polar bears, and thank you so much for your help and your interest in the animal. And please do stay in touch. You can always connect with us on Facebook to keep asking more questions. We wanted to highlight a couple ways that you can get involved depending on what grade you're in or what interest level you might have. One way, where did it go? Well, I don't know where it went, but we have a Flatten a Nook challenge right now. Do you see him? Oh, he was just hiding. Anyone can go online right now. We've got this just fun campaign running into International Polar Bear Day at the end of February. If you'd like to go online and print out your own Flatten a Nook and write your own message in his little sign here, and with your parents' permission, take a photo and send it to us. We're going to do a big collage of Flatten a Nooks all around the world at the end of February, so that's pretty fun. And also check out our Project Polar Bear. So this is an annual contest that we have at Polar Bears International. School groups can sign up with a teacher as a leader, and you can do a project in your school or community with the aim to reduce carbon emissions where you are. And there's all sorts of different ideas out there. You can check out past winners. We announce the contest winners at the end of April, and they do get a small prize, and it's just a lot of fun. We support you throughout the entire process. You'll learn a lot. You can do all sorts of neat things in your school and community. One of our favorite examples is a class that examined their school bus route and actually were able to take buses off of the road and still transport the same number of students to school. So things like that are pretty cool. So check that out if you are interested. And for anyone watching today, it would be fantastic if you would fill out a feedback survey. You can find the link on our website, or you might be emailed it if you registered today. Everyone who fills out the feedback survey will get a link to materials online that aren't publicly available yet, so you'll get some photos and a link to our polar bear safety coloring book, which is pretty fun. And everyone who fills it out, for every survey you fill out, you'll be entered to win a polar bear adoption. So you'll be sent one of these guys among many other little items, and it makes a pretty good class mascot, I think. So please check out our feedback survey for a chance to win a polar bear adoption. So thank you again for joining us today. Thanks to Wirecast for the software that helps us build these programs for you. And please stay tuned for the next few weeks. Next week is Polar Bear Week, so we have a lot going on. We have more of these webcasts. We have Facebook live chats. We'll be posting videos, and you can watch the live Polar Bear Cam on explore.org anytime. We're going to have at least probably another month or so of polar bear action. It's the best time of year for us. It's
Definitely.
pretty fun to be out here watching the bears and to be bringing them to you. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you soon.